Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico 24, the Duke City. In our last main episode, we left off in 1704 with the death of Don Diego de Vargas near Bernalillo. Unlike our previous episodes, where I was mostly just going from one event or time period to the next and kind of covering everything that went on in that time period, for the next couple of episodes up probably at least to the territorial period, but maybe even beyond that, we'll kind of be covering specific topics and then doubling back on ourselves to talk about another specific topic that was going on at the same time. There's just a lot more going on, and it doesn't make sense to kind of talk about things in this disconnected way that we would be doing it otherwise. Today we'll be picking up where we left off with de Vargas' successor, Francisco Cuervo y Valdez, when he became interim governor. Governor Valdez would continue de Vargas' policy of founding more settlements, including the Villa de San Francisco de Albuquerque, although it would soon be renamed San Felipe de Albuquerque, and it would be renamed such because of the new King of Spain, King Philip. The name Albuquerque was chosen because the current Viceroy of Mexico at that time was the Duque de Albuquerque. When it was founded, Albuquerque likely did not meet the minimum number of families to actually count as a villa under Spanish law, regardless of Governor Valdez's claims to the contrary. The future largest city in New Mexico would be founded on a lie. With the arrival of the Americans, they would struggle with the first R in Albuquerque, and it would eventually be dropped in the favor of the familiar Albuquerque. Life in the middle Rio Grande Valley, where Albuquerque is located, was not easy, though. Due to the undefended access points to the valley through areas like Tijeras Canyon, it would be susceptible to raids from the various nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes in the Spanish fringe, especially the Apaches. Governor Valdez would offer grants to anyone who was willing to settle the canyon and other such areas to help deter such raiding. Other similar settlements would be established in other areas, such as Abiquiu and Ojo Caliente. Often, many of these settlements would be founded by Janizarios. Before the founding of Albuquerque, the garrison of Santa Fe was approximately 80 men. The rest of the province was dependent on small compañías volantes, flying squadrons, which were units of 5 to 6 people, and it was planned that they would be highly mobile and, in theory, able to provide quick military support where it was needed. However, the reality was that most people were on their own. Local militias and native allies were often the most common form of defense. And in reality, life outside of the Spanish core was dangerous. For instance, traveling on the Camino Real from El Paso to Santa Fe was taking on a huge risk. Now let's talk about who these raiders the Spanish were contending with were. At a high level, these were semi or fully nomadic peoples. In the south central regions, this was typically the Apaches. To the northwest, there were the Navajos and the Utes, and from the northeast, it was the Comanches. But this is not a hard and fast rule. For instance, the Comanches would strike as far south as Pecos or Galisteo. Many of the areas that saw the most raiding would also have huge population declines. For instance, Pecos would decline from 2,000 people to 600 people, and by 1797, they would only have a population of 189 people. The Spanish response was generally useless against these raiders, though. Annual punitive expeditions to chastise the raiders failed. Often the raiders had a better understanding of the terrain and were better able to hide. Furthermore, the Spanish could rarely correctly identify which group these raiders actually belonged to, even if they were nominally the same people. For instance, the Navajo were made up of highly autonomous groups called bands. If the Spanish could accurately identify that the raiders had been Navajo, how would you know what Navajo band it was actually from? Often the Spanish just ignored these distinctions, though. Navajos had raided and stolen their cattle, and they were going to punish the Navajos. And of course, this gave them the opportunity to also take slaves. Did it really matter if they didn't actually punish those responsible for the raid if they got something back for their losses? Both sides would try to kidnap people during this violence. The result of all of this would kind of be this series of reprisals and counter-reprisals. There would be a raid on a Spanish settlement by a nomadic group. The Spanish would retaliate and attack an unrelated or related band. This band or their allies would return the favor and attack the Spanish. Then it would all repeat again. Until the Americans finally provided enough military attention and focused will in the 1800s, these types of raids and counter-raids would continue. At the rescates, trade fairs, in places like Taos, Picaras, and Pecos, Spanish captives could be ransomed back to the Spaniards. Often, it was a one-way trade with captives being ransomed to the Spaniards and the Spaniards rarely giving back their captives. Although it wasn't universal just to New Mexico, some of these captured Spaniards would end up as far away as San Antonio, Texas. In all, this raiding was closer to what would later be termed a guerrilla war, and was something that the Spanish were unaccustomed to being able to fight against. To add further fuel to the fire, as the fledgling America began to expand, it would push native groups west. Pressure from these new groups would only increase the violence on the plains and into New Mexico, including putting pressure on the groups that were already there, like the Navajos and the Comanches. The strategy the Spanish will eventually arrive on could be best termed peace by purchase. And essentially it functioned by creating an economic dependence on Spanish goods by native groups. This would allow the Spanish to have enough leverage over these groups to actually effectively control them and make lasting peace treaties. It wasn't just constant violence. The Spanish weren't always at war with the Navajo, for instance. At various times, different groups within a specific ethnic or linguistic group or a specific tribe may have a tenuous peace with the Spanish. And this would last until one side or the other saw an advantage to reigniting hostilities. Additionally, kind of going on at the same time, de Vargas had taken advantage of the cooler heads in 1694 to reestablish missionary activity. There would still be some butting of heads between the church and the state, but for the most part, the Pueblo Revolt put an end to all of that. And while a few governors would at various times try to restrict Pueblo religion, overall, the time as New Mexico as a mission field was gone, and the time of the governors really pushing for complete everyone's Catholic, even the native peoples, was over. Overall, the Spanish were taking a more defensive posture with New Mexico in the 18th century. The goal had shifted from having a mission field where you're converting people and you're making money to we need a defensive line that can protect the wealthier settlements to the south, such as Zacatecas and even, to some degree, Mexico City. The plan there was to kind of integrate New Mexico into this defensive line along the Spanish frontier. And we'll talk more detail in future episodes what that kind of looked like. But even now, settlements were expected to be more defensible in shape, kind of being little walled, basically a pueblo, walled off so that if raiders came, everyone could retreat back to the settlement and take refuge there and fight back the raiders or whatever hostile group it may actually have been. But anyone who had hopes of a return to the pre-Pueblo Revolt status quo, those were gone. There was a new arrival in North America that will completely upend the geopolitics of the continent, and that is European powers, most namely for this portion of time, the French. After the French conquest of Louisiana in 1682, which divided Spanish Florida from the rest of the Spanish Empire, at least by land, the French would then set their sights on Texas. The Spanish overall were worried that it wouldn't just end with Texas and included, again, these valuable territories I've talked about, such as Zacatecas. Even before the Pueblo Revolt, the French would begin to approach New Mexico and kind of start encroaching into nominally Spanish territory. In 1680, René Robert Cavelier Sierre de la Salle, who I'm sure I butchered that, I'm horrible with French names, would attempt to create a settlement in eastern Texas. He would end up being murdered by his own men, and the outpost Fort St. Louis would fall prey to local natives like the Karankawas. A few of the survivors would make it to Spanish Coahuila. Two of them, Jean Larvique and Jacques Grolet, would actually end up joining de Vargas during the reconquest of New Mexico. La Salle wasn't the only Frenchman to approach or arrive in New Mexico, however. From 1719 to 1721, the French, under La Harpe, would travel from western Louisiana to Santa Fe. In 1706, Juan de Ulibarri, one of the founders of Albuquerque, led a punitive expedition against the Utes and the Comanches. At El Cuatalejo in southern Colorado, he would report that the Pawnees were actually discussing the French and their involvement and their growing involvement on the plains. In 1719, Governor Antonio Valverde led a raid against the Utes and Comanches to try and curb the growing power of the French on the plains. There, the Apaches told him about the Pawnees using French weapons against them, and that the French had started to live among the natives. In 1720, Valverde would send another expedition of 40 soldiers from Santa Fe, 60 native allies, and some others under Captain Pedro Villasor. Jean Larvique was among them as an interpreter. Villasor's orders were to spy on the French. He traveled to the junction of the North and the South Platte in central Nebraska, but once he arrived there, he was unable to locate any French traders to spy on. On August 13th, while breaking camp to return to New Mexico, they were attacked by the Pawnee. All but 13 of the Spaniards would be wiped out, and when word got back to the colony, it was sent into a panic, fearing that the French had organized the attack on the expedition, and now they were imminently on their way to conquer New Mexico. Some settlers would go so far as to even consider abandoning the colony once again. Villasor's expedition is believed to have been preserved as one of the Segesser hide paintings, which we will talk about hopefully in a future episode. Meanwhile, a war between France and Spain would come to an end in 1721. One part of the overall contention that started this war was Spanish encroachment to the north from places like New Mexico and Texas. Spain did agree to end encroachment and reduce trade between Spanish settlers and the Great Plains tribes, Overall, the Spanish preferred peace with the French over trade with the Great Plains peoples. However, New Mexico would pretty much ignore this agreement, and much like other illegal trade that was already existing before and would only grow from here on out, they continued to trade with the Great Plains peoples throughout the 1700s. The French did not back down from this threat, however, and in 1739, the Malay brothers, with a small group of men, crossed Missouri, went through Nebraska and Kansas to reach Taos and Santa Fe. This proved that the French could successfully cross the plains, despite the great danger present to any group of people trying to make such an expedition. The following spring, they returned to Louisiana and reported to their commander in New Orleans. They were interested in the trade opportunities that existed in New Mexico, despite the Spanish ban on their colonies engaging in foreign trade. A ban that New Mexico would, to varying degrees over the time, pretty much ignore. Between 1741 and 1752, other illegal trading parties would visit Santa Fe. Some of these traders would prove to be more problematic than others and kind of put a black mark on French trading entirely. For instance, in 1749, Pierre Satren and 2 other French soldiers would sell weapons to the Great Plains peoples on their way west. Once in New Mexico, they stole some horses and mules and traded them to the Comanches, who were raiding from the north. These kinds of actions would, at various times, make French traders personas non gratas in New Mexico. In 1752, Santa Fe officials arrested Jean Chappie, who had come from Fort Chartres in modern Illinois. They would confiscate his goods and send him to prison in Mexico City and later prison in Spain. The French Indian War from 1754 to 1763 would pit the English against the French, nominally for control of their North American holdings. This conflict would evolve into the 7 Years' War and would change Spanish-French relations. In 1762, when the French realized that they would lose the war, they would negotiate a land transfer to their relatives in Spain. This would give the Spanish control over Louisiana. To further upset the balance of power in the region, the French often sold firearms to the native tribes they chose to ally with, allowing them to better fight both the Spanish and their own indigenous rivals. This would further weaken the Spanish position against these tribes as these guns spread. Overall, the 1700s, as we'll see, were a time of change for North America, presenting new challenges for New Mexico to try and surmount. Things were more crowded, with new European arrivals beginning to push into the interior of the continent, pressuring the Spanish and displacing the indigenous people as they went. As I'll mention throughout future episodes, New Mexico wasn't high on the Spanish crown's priority list, other than as a bastion against incursions to the south. The Spanish had a, probably not entirely unjustified, fear that these various players, be they European powers or raiding tribes, would disrupt or cease the flow of money from wealth-producing areas of the empire to the Spanish crown. Namely, they were worried about what would be northern settlements of modern-day Mexico like Zacatecas, as well as even as far south as Mexico City itself. A few of the bigger players will need more than just a brief introduction on, then moving on. We'll be spending the next few episodes kind of covering who these people were. We've already covered the French and their early arrival in the area, and we'll be focusing on some of these different indigenous tribes and a little bit of their background and how they rose to become major players before we move on to what the actual Spanish response to these challenges of new rivals and new powers trying to push them out of New Mexico were.
If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.